this just goes to show that we are not going to be able to count on people's selfishness. We've got to make a law against the government regulating. Not just say, well, people are selfish and they'll do what's right for themselves. It doesn't matter if the government has the power to regulate. It should be up to the people and the democracy, and they should be able to vote on it. No, they should not be able to vote on these types of things, because they will ultimately put people in power who are going to benefit them at the expense of other people. And ultimately, as I was saying a few minutes ago, they are going to be restricted. They are not going to benefit, but they don't know that. They're too stupid to know that. Their business is to run a railroad. They're not philosophers. They're not economics majors. They haven't studied history. So to count on them and allow the government to have these powers and just hope that good people, good citizens will be in control of all these powerful government boards, and that the greedy, selfish, monopolistic railroad people won't get control, is just bizarre. It's just bizarre and anti-historical. I'm continuing to quote, contrary to the common view, railroad freight rates declined almost continuously over the period. And although the consolidation of railroads proceeded apace, this phenomenon never affected the long-term decline of rates or the ultimately competitive nature of much of the industry. So, if you look at the historical fact, rates were falling the entire time, even though throughout these years scheme after scheme after scheme is being enacted to stop the rates from being so high, to bring the rates down. Now, the point that I had made earlier, that the rates were prevented from being lowered by law, that simply goes to show that the rates would have fallen even further, that the people would have been far, far better off without regulation. So, I don't know. It's lovely. Lovely. Historical fact is a beautiful thing. We skipped now to page 4. Unless the history of the national regulation of the railroads is approached in the context of the broader efforts of the railroads to attain stability and solve their problems by whatever means seemed most opportune, unless we look at history in this way, the history of railroad regulation will fall into one or another simple and false category. So we've got to start looking at the history of railroads as, quote, we've got to start looking at it in the context of the broader efforts of the railroads to attain stability and solve their problems by whatever means possible. The railroads don't want to go out of business. They don't want to shrink. They don't want to fire people. They don't want to liquidate their assets. They want to grow. Anything that they see that will help them grow. Any type of... Now, that's why you have to have police and law courts, because you will find businessmen who will have other people assassinated. You will find that. I'm not saying businessmen are the greatest people in all of history. They are. But I'm not saying they're completely moral and free of any immoral action. The businesses will do anything they see possible. Not all of them. Some of them will behave morally. But the ones that decide to go after government regulation and try to get regulation brought in will ruin the whole game for everybody. So we simply have to make it illegal for the government to regulate. That's the only thing that we can do at the end. Quoting a further bit down, most railroad men approached the issue of regulation with purely opportunistic motives. Skipping a little, if their motives were usually opportunistic, the functional consequences of their actions were identical to those of a growing number of railroad leaders who explicitly rejected the laissez-faire assumptions of contemporary American conservatism by suggesting that their economic interests and genuine conservatism would be served best by certain types of federal regulation. There it is. Crystal clear. They fought for and wanted regulation, and they thought that to hell with capitalism and laissez-faire, I want my business to thrive. Short-sighted and stupid, but that's what happens when you give the government the power. Some idiot's going to come along and try to use it. Quote, by 1914, in common with most Americans, the railroads overwhelmingly supported the basic premises of what is known as progressivism. Now, sadly, we're facing a situation like that today. We are fighting not progressivism, but environmentalism today. And You do not find in the future, when we look back and we say, you know, cap and trade, if it passes or whatever, all these regulations and the EPA and the onerous, the destruction of the nuclear power industry and so on, all these onerous regulations and stuff, we look back and we're going to be confused to say, well, why was it that big business didn't fight harder against this? No, no, no. Big business wants this stuff. They, even if they don't actually want it, they believe that it's in their best interest to pay lip service to it to the public. British Petroleum with their oil spill going on in the Gulf, and the Exxon Valdez spill back in '89 or whatever it was. These companies are going to come out and say in public, we support more caterpillars and mosquitoes, and we don't want pollution, and we're doing our best to cut down on everything. You know, there's a Ford motor plant built in Germany to manufacture Ford automobiles for Germans, and it's got it's a green roof so that the factory doesn't essentially takes up no space on the planet, because where there would have been this nice field with trees and stuff, now there's a grass and shrubs and trees on the roof. This sort of stuff is opportunistic, is short-sighted. It ultimately will harm these companies, but they are not theoreticians and philosophers. So the answer can't be to leave it up to them. The answer has to be to take the government's power away, to get involved in the beginning. Continuing quote, "The crucial point is that the railroads, for the most part, accepted the basic premises of federal regulation, since only through the positive intervention of the national political structure could the destabilizing, costly effects of cutthroat competition, predatory speculators, and greedy shippers be overcome." Now, like I said, there would have been businesses, railroads and so on, that would have gone out of business, and other ones would have taken over, and they were able to preserve their business with regulation. The cutthroat competition was eliminated, right? The price wars, cutting the price of your freight lower than the other guy, and lower than that, and then lower than your own goddamn costs. That happened. There were railroads that carried stuff at a cost, just so that the other railroad serving the same traffic wouldn't get any money from them, and hopefully would have to go out of business, and then you're left standing at the end of the day. Now that sort of stuff was ruinous, and really the best thing for a company to do in that situation is to compete, keep their price where they can make a profit and give good service, and the other guy, if he cuts his price below, takes a bunch of your traffic and stuff, he can't keep doing it forever. He's going to run out of money. And here's the point, you might go broke. He might drive you out of business, and then he'll raise his rates. And where are you? Now you're broke. You've lost your railroad company. But to bring government regulation in to solve that is insane, and it ruins it for everybody. So let's see if we've got one more bit here on the last page of the introduction. Virtually all histories of railroad regulation have focused on the views and actions of politicians, farmers, or shippers. And the role of the railroads and the railroad men in the movement for federal regulation has largely been ignored, beyond the automatic assumption that they opposed regulation. Such a perspective, in this writer's opinion, is like ignoring the role of the Confederates in the battle at Gettysburg. So he's saying that the railroad executives are as to the Confederates at Gettysburg, the bad guys in defending slavery or whatever. What were the railroad journals writing while their industry was being legislated in certain directions? What were the problems of the railroad industry and their relevance to the regulatory movement? What were railroad leaders saying, writing, and doing? And that's what this book's about. So, I thought that would be interesting to throw that out at you. If I ever get around to doing more of the book and I get donations for it, perhaps you'll hear more about railroads and regulations.